Kansas voters will be filling 5 seats on the State Board of Education this year, both in the primary and the general election, and the issue of evolution in the state science standards is one of the most hotly contested issues you're going to hear on the campaign trail. I'm Dale Goder, Public Affairs Editor at KPTS here in Wichita, and we're going to hear 2 sides of this controversial issue on this edition of On the Record. Joining me in our Wichita studio is John Calvert, Managing Director of the Intelligent Design Network, and Jack Krebs, President of Kansas Citizens for Science. As I noted, gentlemen, what we're interested in is the impact of this on the election. And you're just explaining to me you both represent 501c nonprofit institutions that can't endorse candidates, but you obviously are very interested in this campaign. I'll start with you, Jack. Tell me how this issue presents itself in the election and why this is important.
Well, I was also on the writing committee that wrote the recommended standards that the board rejected, and we wrote top-notch A standards that represent mainstream science as it's practiced around the world. And the board rejected those standards and inserted a creationist intelligent design agenda into the standards. They did this back in 2000 and they did it again. And those standards have received an F. And the rejection of practically every major science organization in the country. So what is at stake here is really mainstream science that is accepted worldwide versus science that's not accepted and is really a product of a political agenda.
Okay, and John, in a capsulized form, from the Intelligent Design Network's perspective, describe the accuracy of that and what you see at play here in the election.
I'm a managing director of Intelligent Design Network, but I also am the spokesperson of 8 scientists that developed the changes to the science standards, 90% of which were adopted by the board. And what I'm interested in is that what Jack just said is like 100% wrong. The changes do not insert intelligent design and do not insert creationism. And what is important from the standpoint of this election is that the voters are informed as to what the board actually did. And if the voters are informed, I believe the voters are going to find that these changes are extraordinarily important and appropriate from both a scientific standpoint and an educational standpoint.
Okay, let's clarify. So you're saying that in these 5 races, all contested, different perspectives, we identify the candidates as having different positions on this issue. But you're saying that the candidates who are running and reflecting a point of view that Jack describes aren't necessarily understanding what the standards are?
It's an incorrect point of view because the changes do not insert intelligent design. The changes actually took out a benchmark which invoked a discussion of intelligent design. The changes insert scientific objectivity into a discussion that cries out for it.
Okay. Actually, we're going to continue on that discussion, but I want to first kind of describe where these races are taking place and which ones of the incumbents are up. We'll go through them one by one. Connie Morris, representing most of western Kansas. It's a huge district because of the population. I don't know how far east it extends. It comes quite a ways. She's running, and her opponent's, Jack, you familiar with that?
Her Republican opponent is Sally Cable.
Okay, and that's a race that displays this issue. There are 2 different perspectives.
Absolutely. Connie Morris is one of the people who voted for the board standards, and Sally Cable is one of the people who agrees with my perspective that those standards should not be there.
All right, and we'll take turns on this one. On the adjacent race, it's Ken Willard from Hutchinson, who is the incumbent, and that district, I'm not sure what it doesn't come, it comes close to Wichita. It doesn't include Wichita. Wichita's seat is not up.
It's centered around Hutchinson, yeah. Great Bend.
In Great Bend.
Yes.
And Ken has a Republican opponent and Democrat opponent, and similarly, these are defined as very distinct different points of view.
Yeah, I think that Ken voted for the standards, and my impression is that his opponents are probably opposing them.
Okay, this is true. Okay, Val Patzer is running.
Brad Patzer.
Brad
Patzer.
I'm sorry, is running in place of Iris Van Meter, who is the incumbent from southeast Kansas. I'm not sure how much of southeast Kansas that district covers. a large, pretty big part
pretty
of
much
it.
southeast Kansas.
Fort Scott, Emporia,
And
Pittsburgh.
has a Republican opponent in the primary,
Janice Tabor.
and that is both in the primary and the general, voters will have that choice.
And then I'm not mentioning the Democratic opponent, not to leave them out, but right now the primary race is what's immediate. And in this case, Iris Van Meter and is of somebody that voted for these board standards, and that the opponent, Janice Tabor, is somebody who agrees with our position that those standards shouldn't be there.
Okay. John Bacon, an incumbent also in support of the standards.
Yes.
That district is in the Kansas City area?
Yes, and his opponent is Harry McDonald, who formerly held the position that Jack Krebs holds, the president of Kansas Citizens for
Obviously,
Science.
a very clear distinction. And
Yes,
that's a primary race. Both
very clear
Republicans?
distinction.
Okay. Do you know what, does that cover Kansas City proper?
There is one other race that's important, and that is the race between Janet Waugh and Jesse Hall. And Janet Waugh is a liberal board member that voted against the standards, and Jesse Hall is a Democrat who I understand supports the standards.
Okay,
I'd like to make one comment. It was actually my turn there. Janet would protest being called a liberal. Janet's a moderate, and the person who is running against her is getting funding and support from the conservative Republican side.
Okay. Well, but you'd all agree
We agree with which side they're on.
which side they're on. How far on which side, I suppose, is up for grabs. Well, what do you, as you've seen those races, I'm sure you follow them probably closer than most people. Is this debate well described for the voters in those districts?
I don't think the debate is well described, and that's what my interest is. My interest is in correcting misinformation. And I think that unless the public has got complete information about this issue, then we can't expect the voting result to be one that fairly reflects, the merit of the standards.
So what you're saying to him is we're not as bad as you think? Is that the,
No,
in terms of, they see you as being bad and crossing the line of science? And
well, the strategy, the published strategy of Kansas Citizens for Science is not to discuss the scientific issues, but to promote the evolution-only model using essentially character assassination to demean rather than to discuss.
Okay, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I find that's not our strategy, and for John to be saying those kind of things, I think it really takes this conversation off. We're quite willing to discuss the scientific issues, but on the other hand, really what's important here are the political, the religious, and the cultural issues. One of the points I would like to point out that John, who has a pamphlet out that makes these charges against Kansas Citizens for Science, accuses us of being promoting atheism and materialism, and we don't. Kansas Citizens for Science believes that people of all religious perspectives can accept science, and there are millions of Christians and theists in general that accept evolution. And John's position, and he's made it real clear in the writings that support the science standards, is that if you accept the theory of evolution, you can't really be a Christian. That's illogical. And I think that that's of great concern. But to accuse us of not being willing to discuss the issues, I think is wrong.
Okay, John, you're shaking your head at that point.
Well, my statements about the strategy is taken from a Kansas Citizens for Science strategy memo. And so what I just told you is essentially a paraphrase of what that memo says. And so I don't think I'm speaking, I'm not speaking incorrectly on that issue.
Well,
now,
take the point he made about, is it when he said you say if you believe evolution, you can't be a Christian?
No. Evolutionary theory is a theory that posits an undirected natural process driven by random mutation and natural selection. That theory itself is consistent with non-theistic religions and belief systems. It doesn't entail an atheistic belief, but it certainly is consistent with those belief systems. The opposite, the idea of a guided process, is a scientific concept that promotes the other kind of religious belief systems, the theistic belief systems. And so the question is, what should the state do when it's going to educate students on where they come from? Should the state only teach the students the materialistic perspective and not allow the students to understand significant scientific criticisms of those perspectives, and they do exist.
Okay, Jack, I'm guessing that point, those criticisms you would describe as non-scientific.
Yeah, and two things. First of all, John says that it's illogical for a Christian to accept evolution. But let's talk about the point he just made. This unguided issue is really central. And the intelligent design people inserted a line into the science standards that says that evolution is an unguided process. And what they are purposefully doing, or maybe they don't understand, is getting confused between scientific notions and theological notions. And I'm prepared to demonstrate a little bit. Here we go. Are you ready? I want you to call this.
Heads.
It's heads. Was that a chance event?
Do I get the quarter?
Sure, you can have my quarter. I don't need it anymore. Was that a chance event?
To me, that represents chance.
Was that a random event?
If the other side of that coin is tails, yes, I would say so.
You don't trust anybody, do you, at this point?
Yeah, I would say so.
John, did God know that was going to come up heads?
I would say no.
Really?
Yes, because it's a random event.
So God, okay, this is the fundamental position. That mainstream Christian theology would say absolutely that God knows what's going to happen, and everything that happens is part of God's plan. If John thinks that God didn't know what happened there, then John's got an idea of God that is really out of the mainstream. And so he thinks that evolution is unguided because there's random events involved. Many, many people totally reject his idea that God isn't involved in those kind of processes. I think that's very revealing.
I didn't know we were going to discuss theology. I thought we were going to discuss the science standards.
John, you are the one that makes the argument. No, John, let me point something out.
Are we going to have a discussion here, or are we going to...
Well, I'll
Okay,
let
go
you
ahead.
respond.
Yeah.
But, and the distinction between theology and science is kind of what is on the table. So
Well, I think when you discuss the question where you come from, now that unavoidably impacts religion. And there are two kinds of religions. There's the theistic variety and the non-theistic variety. And one explanation promotes one kind of religion and the other explanation promotes the other. The explanations don't entail those beliefs, but they certainly support them. And the issue in one of the issues that Jack is talking about is whether evolution postulates a guided or unguided process. And evolution does not postulate a guided process. It postulates a process that has no goal. And if a process doesn't have a goal, it's not guided. And the reason why it doesn't have a goal is because variation, the postulated source of variation is random mutation. And randomness does not produce a goal. So that concept that life results from random mutation is one which supports a materialistic worldview. Now, the question becomes, and the scientific question is that postulate true? When we look at the genome, are we finding random mutations? Are we finding all the mutations random? And the science is suggesting to the contrary.
it is difficult to I would say that what you're most concerned about, though, is at what point this is theologically influenced, and in scientists, what I hear from your movement is that science is well defined. It has principles that it must adhere to,
and it's a limited form of knowledge. It's not. It cannot and does not attempt to make statements one way or the other about theological issues such as ultimate guidance, just like the coin.
But is it not the case you can have this debate about evolution and scientists can take different perspectives because you're talking about something that occurred in the past that's not observable in this fashion, and so which is different from
there's a lot of interesting things about evolution. There's no doubt about that. But the reason I am focusing on this because it's absolutely the heart of John's arguments over and over and over again is that science, if it seeks natural causes only, is inherently materialistic, connected to a philosophy. And that is not a true connection. And the proof that that is not a true connection is that there's millions of Christians who accept that science is a legitimate form of knowledge that is compatible with their belief in God. Now, if John would like to drop all this stuff about atheism and theism and materialistic philosophy, then we could move on. But he is the one that has made this a cornerstone
Okay, when you
of the
say
changes in the standards.
when you say move on, would you say that you would accept a discussion of intelligent design in the context of science?
I'm just saying that as long as he continues to say that the science as it is in the mainstream science is inherently materialistic, then he's bringing a philosophical and religious perspective that is not agreed upon by millions of people. It's a fringe idea, and it's one of the reasons why it doesn't belong in our standards.
Well, the changes Jack proposed was for the Kansas science standards to be strictly materialistic. And that, if you have science that allows that natural phenomena only be explained by matter, energy, and the fundamental forces, and those are the only causes allowed, that is materialism. And that, when you then take that philosophy and say we're going to apply it to the question, the historical question of where do you come from, where does life come from, it only permits one answer. It was interesting because you prefaced this discussion by talking about scientists being able to give their views as to both sides of this, and that is the problem. The perspective that Jack represents is one that does not allow, it is completely unforgiving, it does not allow any difference with his materialistic perspective.
Is it accurate to say that the predominant body of science is on Jack's, if it's described by the number of people described as scientists, most of those people are in his camp?
Well, it is accurate to say that science institutions use this materialistic assumption. And in our view, that is at the institutional level, it's inappropriate. It's not scientific, and it creates a problem when the science institution says, I'm going to impose that view on public education. Because then what that does, it essentially mandates that public education teach only materialism.
But I would guess you'd say the science dictates you have to teach that way.
Here's the deal. This is what science has been doing for about 500 years. Science is a limited form of knowledge that studies how the physical world interacts. And science doesn't and can't deal with issues of morals, spiritual belief, ethics. Those are things that are a bigger part of human existence. And so what John, well, let me mention another key thing about the standards. The standards used to say that science is the process of seeking natural explanations. And these folks have changed that to change to the word adequate, which on the surface may seem innocuous. But if you read their literature, and it's clear in this discussion, this is what they want to do is they want to include supernatural explanations as part of science. When John says that science is biased and has a materialistic viewpoint, what he's really saying is science should include religious beliefs. Science should include God's activities as a possible conclusion. Science can't do that, and the world's mainstream science community has recognized for centuries that science can't include supernatural causes.
John, why can't that be separated in terms of curriculum, that let them teach science wherever they want, and then if you want to talk about elements that are outside that standard definition, you can teach them, but just not in that classroom?
Here's a problem. The problem is that you're going to engage 7th, 8th graders, 9th graders in a question that is almost an ultimate question. Where does life come from? Okay. And the answer to that question is going to impact their religious, ethical, moral views for the rest of their lives, the answer they come to. And the question then becomes, you're the state. Okay, how do I moderate this discussion so that I'm adequately informing them so they're the ones making the decision and not me? In our view, the model that we believe science education should adopt is in a very objective application of the scientific method. When Bacon developed the method, the first thing he did was take out preconceptions. Jack's model puts in a preconception in, a materialistic one. The preconception Bacon took out was a theistic one. We're saying let's just stick with a very objective discussion, scientific discussion, one that does not bring in the Bible or the Quran or any particular religious explanation, but just let's look at the scientific data. When we look at the data, do we believe, is the data consistent with random mutation explaining all of life?
Well, Jack, I have to ask you, this is described as a theistic society. Religion is very prominent in, and so you have just a large bulk of the population accepting a supernatural explanation for things.
That's right.
And science, by definition, can't do that.
Well,
That's the conflict, isn't it?
science is looking at a different part of things. The mainstream theological position is that God acts through natural causes, and that when you examine the physical world and look at what's happened in the physical world, that you are seeing the manifestation of God in the physical world. Just like most Christians would believe sitting in this room that our lives are guided by God. He has a plan, He has a design, and yet we don't see non-material, the scientists studying what's going on here can't look at those things. So that John mentioned impressionable children. First of all, we don't teach anything about the origin of life in 7th and 8th and 9th grade biology. But if we do, and when we teach biology, many science teachers will come in and say early in the discussion, you know, there are many religious views about how this happened. What I'm going to talk about is the evidence that we have about what happened in the physical world. And just because we are explaining things in terms of natural events doesn't mean that we're excluding God's intervention.
Well, let me stop at that point. That seems to be a key distinction. If, in fact, you said John describes that it's illogical for a Christian to accept evolution. Is it? You're not saying it's illogical for a scientist to accept that supernatural explanation of the origin of life?
The scientist as a person can do that, but I don't believe that science. What the let's talk about a few other things that are in the standards. That one of the things that we object to, and we object to two major things, and one of them is the inclusion of the potential of supernatural causes. The other one is that there's a number of issues that have been put into the standards that make it seem like science not only hasn't figured things out, but isn't going to figure them out. And most of those arguments are not accepted by mainstream science. They're part of creationist literature. And really the plan is, and I don't know if it's a conscious plan or not, but the tactic is that if people, children, will doubt that evolution has happened and also accept that God is a reasonable explanation, then they will reject science for God, and that is a false dichotomy.
Okay, I do want to try to define. You can argue about evolution, but does that have an impact on the teaching of science below that?
Let me.
To me, if I'm a voter, I think I'd want to know that.
Let me address this question. What I find fascinating is that the materialistic assumption that Jack embraces
I would like to say,
that does not allow.
Please do not continue to assign
I don't
to
interrupt
me.
his answers.
No.
I don't interrupt
but
his
you
answers.
also keep telling me what I believe.
I don't interrupt his answers. I don't interrupt him.
Don't interrupt anymore.
We can't have a discussion if we're going to interrupt each other.
I won't interrupt.
And Jack's model of the science standards would insert an essentially irrefutable materialistic assumption. And what I find so fascinating is that assumption in actual science, it's only used in one area. It's only used in the area of origin science, the science that asks the question, where does life come from? And if you have this materialistic assumption, then you've answered the question. The answer is a material cause. Okay. Now, what I find so fascinating is that assumption is not used in operational science. Operational scientists are using design as a working hypothesis to understand how the system works, because the system looks extraordinarily designed. It has been described as the most awesome example of information software system that anybody has ever even imagined. And so there is an extraordinary amount of complexity there, and the way scientists are trying to understand how the system works is they're using techniques of reverse engineering. They're hiring software experts to try to unravel the genome. All of these concepts are concepts that are designed. They're not using materialism to understand this answer. So materialism winds up only by happenstance being used in this area of origins, which affects questions that are relevant to religion and
last couple
science.
of minutes, I want to make sure you get a chance to respond on that point.
Let me say this. The points that John is making are soundly rejected by the scientific world, that this is a fact. And the deal is that science standards, this is educationally, are meant to represent core fundamental knowledge. And if John has an argument, and the ID movement has an argument, the people they need to convince is the scientific world. And if they convince the scientific world, then eventually these arguments will make their way into the science standards. But basically, what they have done is unfairly cut to the head of the line. They have used political power to get these things inserted in the standards, even though they are a 1% view.
Okay.
It makes no difference how adamant he feels that he is right. To take this minority view and have it imposed into the science standards is the wrong thing to do.
I guess what should be clear from this is you're both extremely brilliant men, and you're not going to resolve this. You're not going to slowly work towards some resolution, and that's kind of what's on the ballot. I think that's a fair point, though, that this has gone to the arbiter of the election, and that's what we're going to decide from
And I think this is not just an issue of science. This is an issue of education. Science education that impacts other issues of law, issues of philosophy, and so forth. And so for Jack to say the scientists are going to tell the school board, how to educate students about where we come from, that's a problem.
Scientists are probably the best people to tell the school system what should be taught as science.
Well, that's pretty close to the end of our time. I don't think we can, once again, going through those races, what folks need to look at in their respective ballots to those names and understand there's a clear choice. And it is likely to be the case with a slight change in that makeup. This whole thing turns on its ear and we're back arguing as incumbent and challenger in a different fashion. That's kind of on the table. All right, I want to thank you for joining us on this edition of On the Record. I'm Dale Goddard.
Images that terrify.